The Irish pub is undoubtedly one of Ireland's great cultural exports. I'm always astounded when you go to the smallest of villages in France or Spain, you'll still find an Irish pub. And this is also linked to one of the great stereotypes of Irish people, and that is that we're hard drinkers. However, the history behind the Irish pub, and indeed that stereotype that Irish people are somehow hard drinkers, that it's a national stereotype, is pretty controversial, and I think you'll find this video and the history behind the pub pretty surprising. Over the course of the next few minutes, I'm going to look at where the reputation of Irish people being hard drinkers comes from, how that's linked to the emergence of the Irish pub, and where this consistent reputation right up to the present that Irish people drink more alcohol than others comes from, because as you're about to hear, it's actually not true at all. It's a really interesting chapter in our history, and I think you might find some of this controversial. If you disagree with me, I would love to hear your opinion, so please do comment below. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. My name is Finn Dwyer. I'm an Irish historian. I also create the Irish History Podcast, which you'll find linked beneath this video. Here on YouTube, I release regular content every week. The last video I made was on what drinks Irish people have consumed over the last 2,000 years. That was really fun. But to kick off this video, I want to look at where does the stereotype that Irish people are hard drinkers, that it's somehow deeply ingrained in us as a people, comes from, because the origins of that stereotype will definitely surprise you. Identifying where any national stereotype comes from is quite difficult, and that's particularly the case with alcohol. Pretty much every people everywhere in the world at one time or another will have been called hard drinkers, and Irish people are no different. You can find some kind of indirect references about Irish people being heavy drinkers that go back even as far as the Romans. However, if we want to talk about the modern reputation that Irish people have as being hard drinkers, you can go to England in the 16th and 17th century, and that's where we kind of see the emergence of the modern idea that Irish people somehow drank more than others. Now, there's no evidence at all to suggest that was true, that Irish people in the 16th and 17th centuries drank more than anyone else. However, it did serve a very important political purpose in England at the time. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, the English are trying to invade Ireland again, colonise the island. So it's very important for them to try and present Irish people as disorderly, kind of drunken layabouts, and this justifies a colonial invasion and the idea that the English are going to somehow civilise Irish people. So that gives you a sense of where the modern stereotype comes from. It's a pretty racist idea and was used to justify English invasions of Ireland. However, over the following centuries, you do get the emergence of Irish pub culture, which clouds the story a bit, because certainly if you visited Ireland in the 18th, 19th or 20th centuries, you would find a lot of evidence to suggest that Irish people did drink to excess, but it was only part of the story. So let's look at the origins of the pub and Irish pub culture next. So there's no question Irish pub culture has deep roots. 100 years ago in Ireland, just after independence, there was over 16,000 pubs in the island. But if we go back 2 centuries before that, we can clearly see that the pub was already emerging as a centre of Irish life. You know, you can see it right through the 18th century, where revolutionary activity has been organised in pubs, that the pub is very much a hub. You can see it actually in the letters of informers to the British government, where they're talking about things being organised in pubs. So from a relatively early stage, we can see that the Irish pub is very important in terms of wider Irish society. Now, whether that was unique to Ireland at the time, or it was just something that happened all across Europe, is not clear, but certainly that tradition of the pub being at the heart of community life would maintain itself in Ireland long after it disappeared elsewhere. Certainly throughout the 19th century, we can see in a lot of villages that pubs are very important institutions, and this distinguishes Irish people and the way they drink from other peoples. So for example, in Southern Europe, people might consume more alcohol. However, they tended to do that in the privacy of their own homes, whereas in Ireland, people are drinking in pubs. If they get drunk, when they leave the pub, they're visibly drunk in public. So this reaffirms the idea, to visitors at least, that Irish people are really heavy drinkers, because when they come to Ireland, they see people drinking in pubs all the time, and they assume that this representation of Irish people reflects wider Irish society. However, that's not the case, because next I'm going to reveal a forgotten part of this story, and that's how Irish people had some of the highest rates of abstinence from drinking alcohol anywhere in the world. If alcohol consumption is part of our historical culture, well then abstinence from alcohol is very much part of our historical culture as well. So let's look at that now. For centuries in Ireland, there's been a very strong tradition of people abstaining from alcohol. So if we go back, say, to the start of the 19th century, we can see early abstinence movements organised by the Protestant churches to try and stop people drinking alcohol. This is taken up by the Catholic Church in the 1830s and 1840s when a Cork priest, Father Theobald Matthew, led what was called at the time a crusade against drinking, and he would get somewhere in the region of 1 million people across Ireland to pledge not to drink alcohol on the eve of the famine. Now his movement would collapse under the weight of the Great Hunger, and in the following decades, while that abstinence movement remained a feature of Irish life, there's no question that the pub did continue to embed itself as a place where Irish people gathered but also drank. So that culture of drinking very much in public took deep roots in Irish society through the course of the 19th century. Now at this point in the video, I've kind of presented two different kind of historical traditions in Ireland. One where you have this kind of vibrant public pub culture, and another though that's quite opposed to alcohol consumption and I suppose that pub culture. So you might wonder then, how is it today that Irish people are synonymous with being hard drinkers? And I think to understand part of that at least, we need to cross the Atlantic and look at the experience of Irish immigrants in places like New York, Boston and other big US cities, because that's where some of this stereotype of the Irish being really hard drinkers would deeply embed itself, not only in the Irish psyche but internationally as well. In the aftermath of the Great Hunger, millions of Irish people would leave Ireland. By 1900, 2 in every 5 Irish people were living outside the island, and most of them were in the United States. However, when they brought Irish pub culture to New York, this really reinforced the idea in wider American society that Irish people were really heavy drinkers, because again, we don't know if they're drinking more than other people, but they're certainly drinking more in public, and it's visible to people on the street that the Irish tend to be big drinkers. And the fact that the pub is an important part of Irish culture and Irish immigrant culture is another aspect of kind of that visible drinking culture that the Irish brought with them to the US. It is possible that Irish immigrants drank more than other people. We do know, for example, they were often poor, lonely, isolated, and obviously going to the pub would help break that. But I am skeptical about the origins of this stereotype. I think a lot of it has to do with the ways Irish people drink. Because if we take the story back to here in Ireland in the 20th century, when we start to get data about how much Irish people are drinking, the results of that are very surprising. By the 20th century, we get the first accurate picture of how much alcohol Irish people are drinking, but also how much alcohol people around the world are drinking. And the results of this certainly question that idea whether Irish people are somehow kind of innately bigger or harder drinkers than other countries. So for example, consistently through the 20th century, Ireland was never the top consumer of alcohol. By the 1970s, the US, the UK and all of continental Europe were consuming more alcohol than the Irish. However, that stereotype of Irish people being hard drinkers was deeply embedded across the world and indeed in Ireland itself. And I think it goes back to two things. First of all, that pub culture that Irish people drink visibly, but secondly, that abstinence movement that I talked about was really powerful all through 20th century Ireland. By 1959, when the population of the 26 counties of Ireland was only 2.8 million, 500,000 people had taken a pledge not to drink alcohol. So alcohol consumption in Irish society is concentrated into smaller numbers of people who are probably binge drinking, drinking to excess. And again, this is happening in public. Now, I think that underscores that there is a problematic attitude towards alcohol in Ireland. It's not consumed as part of kind of daily life. It's not consumed in moderation, but probably, and it's very hard to get specifics on this, but it seems that it was consumed in large quantities by smaller numbers of people. Now, I think two things really have solidified that reputation, and we can't blame anyone outside the island for this. This is our own fault. So the first is kind of a tolerance or a glorification of drinking that has definitely taken place in Ireland, and then the commodification of pub culture, where basically we've sold it all around the world. So let's look at them to finish the video off. I think over the last 100 years, Irish society has been unusual in the way it has glorified and accepted alcoholics. The most obvious example is probably the writer Brendan Behan, who drank himself to death at 41. And people somehow kind of, I think, conflate or confuse his alcoholism with his creative output. Now, Brendan Behan had lots of demons. I think those demons inspired his creativity. I think it also inspired his drinking, but I think it doesn't necessarily mean that his drinking led to his creativity. But there is a constant attempt right through Irish society into the present to justify what is often problematic drinking. And I think part of that is because the pub has been so central to a lot of communities over the last 100, 200 years. On top of that, there's obviously a huge commercial aspect to this. Guinness is one of the most famous Irish brands anywhere in the world, and they invest a lot of money in presenting alcohol in, I suppose, a more positive light. Alongside that, you've got the Licensed Vintners Association, which is one of the oldest lobby groups in Ireland, and they have helped to foster this idea at home that our drinking culture is something to be celebrated. Now, to finish, I'm not against drinking in pubs. I do it all the time myself, but I do think the history of Ireland's drinking culture, our pub culture, and the stereotype of us being really hard drinkers has a more problematic history than you might think. Now, I'd love to hear your opinions on this. I think I've come across as like a total killjoy. I love, as I say, going to pubs myself, but I do think the history is definitely more complex. So do give me your thoughts. I'd love to hear your opinions on this. And finally, if you've got this far, please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. There's lots of great content in the back catalogue. I have a whole series on the Great Hunger. Or you can check out this video right here, which looks at the various different drinks Irish people have consumed over the last 2,000 years. It's a nice companion to this video. I'll be back next week with a new video on Irish history. Until then, slán.